out something. Well, there were several reasons that were given for.
Now, why is it that the volume isn't?
For Thales, choosing water as the ultimate substance. Now remember, the problem these pre-Socratics are dealing with is the perennial problem of the one and the many. Is ultimate reality at rock bottom only one sort of substance, or is it irreducibly many kinds of things? And they've given, their own answers to this question. There was, most of the writers seem to agree that there was something like the four-element theory around. But what these writers are trying to do is to say, well, okay, the four-element theory says that ultimate reality is irreducibly many kinds of things. Earth, air, fire, and water, right? The wet, the cold, the hot, the dry, if you want to put it that way. But Thales says, no, we can do better than that. We can, at rock bottom, say it's one kind of substance. And if you're going to have an ultimate substance, you need a substance that can take many forms. And one reason often given for Thales' choice is that we can observe that water has three forms that we can visibly, put ourselves in contact by: solid, liquid, and gaseous form. But Thales speculates that, well, maybe it takes other less obvious forms. And I try to bring in this example of trying to put a damp log in a fireplace or a wood stove, and you look at the smoke that comes from it, and it's pretty hard to tell what is steam and what is smoke composed of particulate matter, and did they have the capacity to make a good distinction between the two? So why not think that wood is, in a sense, water? And of course, we do know that things like that are composed partly of water, right? What's it? Cucumbers are something like 98% water, or some ridiculously high figure. So at any rate, certainly one reason might be that he observed that here's a substance that can certainly take on many forms. Now Aristotle, to get into the review sheet, Aristotle's reason for why Thales chose water as a primordial stuff has to do with the fact that water is necessary for life. It has that importance. And, so, again, the important thing here is not whether Thales is at rock bottom right. Russell used to argue in his introduction that there were some speculations 100 years ago that everything might be made up of something like hydrogen, which is 2/3 of water. Right? I don't know, but at any rate, not bad. Now, the thing, all things are full of gods. As I mentioned the first time, when I read this, I used to think of it in terms of a primitive animism of the sort that you still see in isolated tribes today. That is the view that spirits inhabit just about anything, that they can be in a rock, a piece of wood, a tree. So if you say all things are full of gods, maybe he meant something like that, a primitive animism. The text on which I based the PowerPoint tried to paint a different picture. They tried to paint Thales as wanting to get away from the mythological view, even though this doesn't look like it, but it's maybe not having the language available to him to couch his own theories in. And the best he could do is to say, well, all things are full of gods, when what he was really trying to get at is, if you try to look for an explanation for why things happen in nature, don't look beyond the things in nature. In other words, naturalistic explanations are possible. Don't look towards the agency of external forces, external deities, like that Aristophanes portrait of Socrates, arguing against the view that all things, the view that it's Zeus who makes the rain. This is to say, if he's saying look within things in nature for the principles on which they work and not to the agency of external deities, then he's coming closer to breaking away from the mythological perspective and going to the scientific naturalistic perspective. And again, at this point, there is no real distinction between philosophy and science. Right? So I answered the last question first, right? It's the problem of the one and the many. And of course, Thales' answer then is that things are not irreducibly many. We can reduce everything that exists to one kind of thing, namely water. Now, Anaximander, we have some pretty detailed arguments in the slides, but I'm going to hit like the main points. Why Anaximander needs something more basic than the received four elements for his primordial stuff. And again, the apeiron, which is translated boundless, indefinite, sometimes infinite, his primordial stuff is something more basic than the observable four elements. And of course, one of his main reasons is that he thinks if we made one of them dominant, like Thales wants to do, obviously, right? He wants to make water dominant. If we made just one of them dominant, then it's going to take over. Everything would be obviously water. So his view is that it can't be any one of the usual four elements if we're looking for a primordial stuff, if we're trying to reduce, what there is in nature to one kind of thing. It has to be something more basic than any of the four elements that were usually thought of. And so the boundless is an indefinite, sort of a homogeneous mass. Russell calls it a sea of being with a capital B, out of which everything comes. This is why I tend to lend some it seems to me credible that Anaximander may have made the trip to, I think it was Mesopotamia. It was either Egypt or Mesopotamia. But it doesn't matter because they both had the same kind of creation myths where the world comes out of a sort of primordial sea of existence. Everything, even the gods, come out of that in Egyptian and Mesopotamian mythology. And so here's Anaximander with a view that's very similar to those views, that what we need is a sort of primordial sea of being that he calls the Apeiron, A-P-E-I-R-O-N. Now, another reason why he thought that the elements, that if we had a primordial stuff, it couldn't be one of... in my own private thinking, I like to refer to them as the Big Four, but don't do that because nobody else does. You know, the Big Four, earth, air, fire, and water, is that these were perennially thought to be paired as opposites, and you've got a slide that really illustrates that: the wet and the dry, the hot and the cold. And so the thought is, even back then, they knew that opposites tend to cancel each other out, right? I can evaporate water with fire, but if I douse the fire with water, I can extinguish the fire with its opposite. And so they knew that opposites tended to cancel each other out. And so how is it that an opposite is going to change into its opposite? But that would have to happen if only one of those were the primary element. So he says, unlikely that things are going to change into their opposite. Wouldn't they have more of a tendency to cancel each other out? So, features of the world which for Anaximander separates out the elements from the chaos of the boundless. The boundless here is the Apeiron. And here your book has a much simpler account of this. It says that he thought that there was like a catastrophic event, maybe analogous to, certainly not the same as the Big Bang. In other words, some sort of a catastrophic event, much like an explosion that separated out earth, air, fire, and water from the boundless. Now, what you see in the slides is a more detailed account of what other experts in the field say, and that's that he may have had the view that it is the motion of the entire universe. Now remember, you have to think of this in terms of a geocentric universe, the old Ptolemaic, even though this was before Ptolemy. The view that the Earth is the center of the universe and everything is revolving around it. Well, if you think about that as the whole universe having a kind of circular or vortex motion, then this account says maybe the four elements get separated out because the entire universe acts like a kind of centrifuge which would separate out things according to their weight. And so the motion is, the vortex motion of the universe is what separates out the elements. That's the other account of this. And so the elements are separated by their density, right? You've got the least dense, fire, an outer fiery layer, and then and then you say, well, wait a second, I look at the sky at night and I don't see a layer of fire. Well, he says there's a covering over it, and what we see is the stars is merely points of light shining through holes in the covering, illuminated by the outer layer of fire. It was also thought that this fiery outer layer is where the gods are. And the next in is air, right? Then water, and then earth. And this view, persisted. Aristotle had a primitive notion of gravity, but it's different. He called it place. In other words, if I knocked something off the table there and it fell, and somebody said, well, why does it fall? We could all tell what we grew up learning in school, that the force of gravity pulls it down to the earth, that attractive force. But Aristotle's account is different. Aristotle's account is, why do flames go up? Well, they're seeking their proper place towards the edge of the universe, up there at the top. Why does something fall when I knock it off the table? It's seeking its proper place at the center of the universe, where Earth is, So, at any rate, that view that, elements are separated out is a view that was very prevalent then and remained prevalent even past the pre-Socratics in things like Aristotle's notion of place. Well, so that's all we're going to say about Anaximander. Just there aren't going to be any questions on Anaximenes. He's mentioned in your book. I probably should edit him in. I wanted to keep it. There are other pre-Socratics like Pythagoras who would be well worth studying, but we just can't do it all, right? If we're going to go into any detail, then it's there are time limitations. But the thing is, Anaximenes is back to air. And you say, well, why does he do that? Well, Richard Rorty, 20th century philosopher, who was at Virginia when I was there, very famous, said, well, when you hear a philosopher use a word that just seems incomprehensible, you can have two reactions. You can say, well, that concept is very deep. It's full of profundity and philosophical meaning and depth, more so than I can get my puny brain around. I'm elaborating on Rorty. Or the other way you can go is to say, well, maybe it only looks like it's deep. Maybe that concept really is empty. Maybe it has no clear meaning at all. And we'll see Hume going in that direction in his skeptical arguments later on. And this was kind of the reaction of Anaximenes, who, remember, Anaximander was a pupil of Thales. Anaximenes was a pupil of Anaximander. And he says, look, this Apeiron stuff is just too mysterious for me. Let's get back to the big four, right? But this time, he brings in a force, the force of condensation and rarefaction, And he says everything's air, and everything can be accounted for as different, as air at different levels of, you know, in compactness, I guess. You know, the soul and fire are very thin air, you know, than air itself, and then, you know, water is thicker air, and then earth and rocks are very thick air. You know, so again, not going to talk about Anaximenes, but he goes back in the other direction. Well, Heraclitus and Parmenides, two philosophers that have opposite views, but that we saw Plato reconcile in his two-tiered theory of reality. What did Heraclitus mean by saying that we cannot step in the same river twice? Well, of course, there he's referring to the waters. They're in constant motion. They're constantly changing, like the flames of a fire. And their change is so fast that no matter how quick you were at putting your toe in the waters the second time, they're not the same waters in the sense that they will have changed from the time you first put your toe in them to the time you put it in again. And I think your book throws another wrinkle in and says, well, you will have changed too, but I don't want to dwell on that comment. Can river be taken in more than one sense? Well, yeah, there is a sense, though, in which we all know what we're talking about if I tell you that, yeah, hey, the Gunpowder River out there is the same river we used to go tubing in when I was your age. And so, you know, that it's a body of water that flows in a specified channel held in by particular banks gives it its identity as one in the same river. And so he understands this. So his view is more complex than just that everything's in flux. He says underlying this flux is a kind of unity which he calls the Logos, L-O-G-O-S. And part of philosophy, part of philosophical wisdom for him, in fact, the heart of philosophical wisdom for Heraclitus is understanding this principle of oneness. And very often it's portrayed as a principle of oneness underlying opposites. In a river, the banks are trying to hold the water in, the waters are trying to push it away. And we had other examples of a road going up and down. Again, you know, if somebody came to you on the street or, you know, around campus and said, do you know that the same road can go up and down? You know, you might think, well, here's somebody who is, you know, an order of fries short of a Happy Meal. I mean, this is a strange comment for somebody to say. In other words, this preoccupation with opposites just doesn't strike us as that important nowadays. But they were just fascinated with this in Greek times. I mean, Socrates, you know, a few hundred years after the pre-Socratics, one of the arguments of the Phaedo concerns opposites and whether if life has its opposite in death, well, if there's a transition one way from life to death when we die, why shouldn't we assume that there's movement in the opposite direction and that, you know, somebody's dead, they're going to live again by being reincarnated? Now, I'm not saying that that's a particularly good argument. You know, one thing my old dissertation advisor who taught the, you know, class of 300 students at UVA would point out is, you know, I can leave this cup of warm coffee here, right? And we all know that if I leave it here this afternoon, it's going to be cold. It's going to get cold. So it's going to go from its opposite, hot, to cold. But just because it does that doesn't mean that it's going to spontaneously heat itself back up again. So for Socrates to argue that life has its opposite in death, and that if we go from living to dead, why wouldn't the transition go the other way is not a very good argument. But look, no questions on that. But an aside, and just an example of how much, even into Socrates' time, the Greeks were fascinated by opposites. And of course, you find this even in the 19th century in the Hegelian and Marxist, Marx was influenced by Hegel, idea that the whole development of history is a struggle between opposites. You know. Okay, back to this. So give some ample examples. Well, you see them in the slides, right? I just mentioned a few of them. You know, water can be good and bad. A pen can write crooked and straight lines. So again, the principle of oneness for him is the logos. That is this principle of unity underlying a tension of opposites. And the significant place of strife is that he thinks that the world order depends on this tension between opposites. I don't get, I mean, when I would change the strings on my guitar, you know, you put a new string on there, you're not going to get any music until you put some tension on that string. You know, it's going to, and tension is, you know, the tension of the bridge at one end and the tuning peg at the other, and you're pulling on it to keep it tight. And we mentioned this quote where he says Achilles was wrong when he was wishing for all strife and tension to go away, because if the whole world order depends on a constant struggle or tension between opposites, to wish that the tension would go away is essentially to wish that the whole world order would go away. And so Achilles didn't know what he was wishing for. Probably the hardest philosophical argument we've come across thus far in the course is the one advanced by Parmenides. So, I mean, there are two words a posteriori, you see the word post after, based on experience. But Russell points out that in the tradition of Western philosophy, Parmenides is probably the first philosopher to have used what we call an a priori argument, which is prior to and independent of experience. In other words, his argument is based merely on concepts. It doesn't bring in any observations about the world around him to try to establish his point that there is no change. And in fact, its conclusion goes against what our senses tell us. But the philosophers who have relied on these sorts of arguments, and they pop up again and again in the history of philosophy, their view is if my argument tells you something different from what you think your senses tell you, so much the worse for your senses, so much for your senses. Or I like to quote Groucho Marx on this. You know, he said, well, are you going to believe me or are you going to believe your lying eyes? You know, well, that's kind of the response of somebody like Thales. You know, are you going to believe what you see, that everything's in change? Not Thales, but Parmenides. Are you going to believe what your senses tell you, that everything is changing, or are you going to believe me? And my argument that nothing really changes, that what we call being with a capital B or reality is always one, always changeless, and always eternal. And note, these are the characteristics of Plato's forms. Plato takes from Parmenides the idea that ultimate reality has to have these kinds of characteristics, being eternal, changeless. I mean, the form of beauty doesn't change for Plato. Circularity doesn't change. A circle is eternally what it is. And so he gets that part of his theory from Parmenides, and of course the idea that this world, this material world, the world our senses put us in touch with, is not a world of being with a capital B, but a world of becoming, that everything is constantly changing in this world, is constantly becoming something else, and is therefore not even self-identical. That view Plato applies to the world our senses put us in touch with, the world inside the cave. And that is Heraclitus' world. So the way he portrays change, Parmenides, is coming into or going out of existence. In other words, ultimate reality does not come into existence, does not go out of existence. Now note how similar this is. I'm not saying he came up with Newton's, what is it, his second law, the law of conservation of matter and energy. It's been a while. You know, it was like 1965 when I had physics. We had physics back then, folks, when I was in high school. The point is, that matter is neither created or destroyed, but it simply changes forms. And of course, Einstein came along and said, well, yeah, matter can also change into energy. Very similar to this view that what exists is unitary. And so change for Parmenides is coming into or going out of existence. What argument does he use to show that there cannot be any change in this sense? Well, the argument relies on the fact that we cannot even refer to or conceive of nothingness, what does not exist. And so you can't have change in the direction of coming into existence, because it has to go from that impossible state of nothing to the status of something. And you can't have something going out of existence because it goes from the state of existing to the impossible state of non-existence. So if change cannot go either way, then there can't be change. There's just what exists, and it exists eternally. And it's also unitary because, in other words, his solution to the problem of the one and the many is that everything is a big one. Because if something is different from something else, then there's a sense in which it is not that thing, and there you bring in the idea of what something is not. Okay. Well, again, I'm going to ask you to know the big points. The whole thing about the objective part is there are some things, some of the main points of what we cover that I'd like you to carry away from the course in your head, and that's what we emphasize on that. The detail you can bring out in your essay, which of course is due Thursday. Okay. What part does the observation that we cannot even think of nothing play in this argument against change? Well, I think I just went into that, maybe ad nauseum. Well, the prisoner's situation, what they wear. Well, the key thing here is that besides having their hands chained, their head and necks are chained so they can behold only what's in front of them, and what's in front of them is what is on the back of the wall. That's what their vision is limited to. Of course, the prisoners are supposed to be like us, and that should prompt the question, well, in what sense are they like us? And we looked at this as, in part, a story about what philosophy tries to do in a more general way, in a way that's as applicable today and to our situation as it was back 2,500 years ago when Plato wrote this, that we all have absorbed a lot of beliefs. Like the prisoners in the cave, we have a lot of beliefs that we've gotten from simply being immersed in our own culture, right? We've gotten them from TV, from things we've read, from school, from our place of worship, a myriad of other places, obviously online. And that's the point of the talk later on, to, underscore that point again by having you actually look for a philosophical view in a song or in a video clip. So the prisoners are supposed to be like us in the sense that they grow up with a set of beliefs, and their set of beliefs, since they only see the back of the wall, is about what's on the back of the wall, namely the shadows. And of course, the situation is that they're facing the back of the wall, and what projects the shadows, well, there's a raised way behind them. There are people carrying things behind them, and there's a fire behind those people that cast shadows on the wall. But the prisoners have not grown up knowing anything but the shadows, and so for them, reality is the shadows. And so this story of the Odyssey of the escaped prisoner is a story of sort of the philosophical journey of somebody. The prisoner is made to forcibly to turn around and confront reality. And it's a hard thing to do. Hard for us to confront the basis for the beliefs that we grow up with. Hard for him to look at the fire and the people carrying things. And there's also a mental adjustment period. If somebody tells us things are very different from how we have conceived them to be, we don't automatically say, oh, of course you're right. Plato portrays the released prisoner, the person who's dragged up forcibly out of the cave, when he's confronted with the fire and the people carrying objects, basically doesn't want to admit that the real things are the things casting the shadows, not the shadows. But eventually it comes around. Now, of course, sorry about that. Voicemail take. So at any rate, the cave then represents this world, the world our senses put us in touch with, what is often called the sensible world. Right? And the objects on the cave wall, which have less reality than the stuff that are carried to cast the shadows, they represent images, representations of things. And so for Plato, there are degrees of reality. A shadow of a table has less reality than a table. A drawing of a table has less reality than the table itself. A reflection of a table in a mirror or in water has less reality than the original. So even within this world, there's a difference in reality between material things like a table and the images or representations of them, which clues you into why in Plato's Ideal Republic he thinks that the visual arts deserve such a low place, because they deal with things far removed from reality, with representations of things, whether it be a statue, a painting. And so again, the cave represents things in this world, the world of the senses. The fire, here's where it gets tricky. The fire represents the sun in this world that illuminates things in this world, just as the fire illuminates things in the cave. So when we're inside the cave, we're in the world you and I are living in right now. We we're all material boys and girls in the material world, to quote Madonna here, right? And so the prisoners, we're in the material world, and like the prisoners, we tend to think of things in the material world as the most real things. We tend to think, this is reality, folks. We can feel it, touch it, lift it up. This material table, this particular table, that's what's real. That's what my sense of puts up. And of course Plato is trying to stand that on its head. He's going to try to convince us that the general form of tableness, or the table, the one blueprint that sets the standard for what a table is eternal, unchanging, didn't come into existence like this table did, won't go out of existence. isn't in a state of change. It has more reality than this individual table. The form of a triangle has more reality than any particular table I can draw. And of course, that's very different from constructivism, the school in mathematics that I think influenced my geometry teachers at Poly. When they talked about a perfect triangle, they called it an imaginary triangle. It's not real. There aren't any perfect triangles here. For Plato, there's an eternally existing perfect triangle. And far from being an imaginary thing, it's got more reality than any particular triangle in this world. The form tableness has more reality than any table. You know, so when you get outside the cave, you're into the world of the forms. And even in the world of the forms, and your book takes a slightly different interpretation, but you know, the interpretation I grew up with is that even, and I'm not going to ask you questions about this, right? But some people portray the forms. You can almost portray it as like the food pyramid, right? You know, that even in the world of the forms, you have forms of sensible objects like tables and things. Then you can get more abstract, and you've got forms for like mathematical objects. And then you've got forms for concepts that you cannot represent, you know, like justice, you know, holiness. And at the top of the heap, what do we have at the top of the heap? What is the form above all forms, right? Goodness itself, or the form of the good. With a capital G, right? And that's the most fully existing form. And what represents the form of the good in the intellectual world, in the world outside the cave? This is where it gets tricky. The sun in the world outside the cave doesn't represent the sun, but it represents the form of the good. Now, let me say something. I never, and here you're getting my own intellectual prejudices. I never have been a big fan of going into the divided line. I like talking about the allegory of the cave. Your book, your author is just absolutely fascinated with the divided line. But basically, there are two different ways that Plato represents this distinction, this two-world theory of reality, you know. And, you know, your book goes into that in more detail. But, so the fire represents the sun in the sensible world, which illuminates things in the cave, and the sun outside the cave represents the form of the good, the head honcho form, the form above all forms. Right. Okay. Well, and as we said, the objects casting the shadows are particular things in this world. The released prisoner represents somebody who's taken a philosophical journey. Call it the philosophy student. Some books just call him the philosopher, you know, or the philosopher in training. Obviously, the person who leads him up is the mature philosopher or the philosophy teacher, or specifically Socrates, Because what happens? The prisoner goes back before his eyes can adjust. He sat down with his fellow prisoners in the darkness of the cave, and he can't see a thing. Plus, he's eventually come to see even the sun outside, so he's got sunspots in his eyes, too. And his fellow prisoners aren't very impressed by this little philosophical journey he took. And really, I think Plato knew even in his day, the average man on the street didn't have a lot of use for abstract philosophical ideas. Remember, most Greeks were either farmers or shopkeepers or something like that. They weren't aristocrats. They couldn't follow Socrates around. The people who could were people and children of people with means, independent means. Okay, so at any rate, so the world outside the cave is the world of the forms. So, yeah, what I was saying is the prisoner goes back. His fellow prisoners say, look, this guy's eyesight has been ruined by this journey. Don't you dare try to take me on one of those journeys out of the cave. If you do, I'm going to kill you. I mean, that's how ardent they are about it. And of course, Plato has in mind Socrates, who went around questioning people in his own society about views they had, like Thrasymachus' view that justice is what's in the interests of the stronger, might makes right, and tried to show them that they didn't know as much as they thought they knew, and they went and killed him. Socrates was trying to take the people of Athens on a philosophical journey, and many of them would not go. Now remember, this dialogue was written after Socrates' trial and death. Plato is reflecting back on what he had written down or remembered of Socrates. Okay, so the attitude then toward the released prisoner is the journey didn't do the released prisoner any good, and don't take us on it. I don't know why I have the meaning of autonomy in there, but basically it's the leeway to decide for yourself. We said we're going to give you some autonomy in here. We're going to present conflicting positions on just about everything we study, every topic. And I'm not going to tell you what to think. I'm not going to tell you what I think, but I'm going to say, well, who do you think comes closer to being right? And that's how some of the essay questions are worded. Okay, so that little thing, the myth, the parable of the cave, it really just repeats what's beforehand. I think I cut and pasted some of this together from various review sheets. Now, the rationalist views of Plato and Aristotle on human nature, well, we didn't say very much about Aristotle, and we won't really until next week, after test one. But Plato's three-part soul, somebody sent me an email saying, okay, does this really correspond, that the head corresponds to the rational element and has as its virtue wisdom, the chest, what's above the stomach, corresponds to the spirited or emotional element of us, and it has as its virtue courage, and the lower part of us, our lower nature is represented, with the stomach and below, and the virtue that we need to cultivate is the virtue of self-control over the appetites of our lower nature. So here again, you have moderation coming in as a guiding principle, right? Plato's not saying, hey, deny the needs of your body, you know, be like some of the mystics and live on just air, you know. No, I mean, your body has needs for food, drink, sexual fulfillment. Don't deny yourself those things, but don't go overboard, you know. Keep things in check. And so, how do we become a just person? Well, for Plato, a just person is a sort of integrated whole where all three parts work together in harmony and are doing their proper function. Where reason rules and our emotional nature, it rules over our emotional nature by allowing us to keep in check emotions like anger, but also allowing us to deal with fear and cowardice and overcome that and promote courage. And even today, we speak of somebody as having a breast full of courage. You know, goes back all the way to Plato's distinctions. And you know, we keep in check the desires of our lower nature. And so in the chariot, right, the charioteer, of course, represents the rational element, reason. The charioteer should be in control, right? Well, reason should be in control, and why? Because it's the most godlike part of us. It's the part of us that is most like the forms in its properties, but it's also the part of us that's most like the gods. And if the gods, by the whole nature of things, were meant to rule over us, over human beings, then the part of us which is most like the gods, our rational part, should rule over the rest of our nature for Plato. And when that happens, everything is as it should be, and we can become a just person. Now, we saw that in Plato's ideal state, while everyone has all three parts to their nature, different people, just by birth, are dominated by different parts of their nature. And so the people who are dominated by the appetitive element, he thinks, just naturally gravitate into occupations in society that, whose purpose is providing for the rest of society their needs for food and drink and what have you. They are the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker, and also the banker for Plato. And so if your appetitive element dominates, that's where in society you ought to be. And by the way, in Plato's ideal state, he kind of left them alone, more or less. He thought they should have a kind of practical morality that we teach them to not go overboard with things. But he basically lets them live their lives. But Plato is much more controlling, obviously over the military class for reasons that are still true today, right? But also over the ruling class, the guardians. Now remember, this is not a democracy. Where's the power in a democracy? With the people who are at the bottom, the people dominated by the appetitive element, because those are the most people in society, right? I think it was Lincoln or what was it, Lincoln or Mark Twain? Somebody once said God must have loved the common people because he made so many of them. Well, I mean, in a democracy, you have rule by people dominated by the appetitive element. Plato doesn't want that. Rule in a just state is not a job for the average man or woman on the street. It should be a job for specialists. And so he wants an elite group of specialists singled out of society at a young age to be in the guardian class, the ruling class, the philosopher kings. Why philosophers? Again, it has to do with ruling a state justly and wisely. Who knows more about justice and wisdom than people who are dominated by the rational element, because knowledge of these things comes through reason more than through the senses. So philosophers ought to rule in a just state. But again, we look back and we say, well, who guards the guardians? Plato doesn't have any checks and balances in his ideal state. Well, Plato seems to have naively fallen back on something that Socrates believed a bit more than he did. That is, to know the good is to do the good. That somehow, if we know what's right, we're going to do it. And so if people act immorally, that is a failure of education. So he seems to have this naive faith that if the guardians know the good better than anyone else, they're going to do the good, and they are going to rule the state justly and wisely. But again, it's a very authoritarian state. New guardians, new rulers, new members of the ruling class are selected by current members of the ruling class through a program of standardized testing, and they're groomed to be in that class, for Plato. So it's an authoritarian politics. He wants them to be singled out from their families, to live in like a military barracks situation, to not have much money or possessions, because Plato knows you can be corrupted as a political leader by greed for things and money. So at any rate, so that's some of Plato's idea. And so for him, justice in a state is like justice in a person. The state is the individual writ large across the sky. It is the working together of all of the classes in society doing what they were meant to do and they're supposed to do, right? The appetitive element providing for the needs, the material needs of everybody. The police soldier class assisting the guardians in ruling over the masses and keeping them in check. Just like the noble horse assists who represents of the police soldier class, the military class. Plato calls them the auxiliaries because they go alongside and assist the guardians in ruling the state. And they keep the unruly steed, who represents the common man on the street, the rabble, the masses, in check. And reason should rule. The guardian should be at the head of a just state. And if that happens, then you get a just state. So for Plato, ain't but more than one model to a just state, and you just got it, right? That threefold model. Now for Aristotle, it's a little different. Aristotle thinks any form of government can be a just form of government as long as it's about promoting the eudaimonia, the happiness of its citizens and increasing that. Doesn't have to be an aristocracy. Could be a democracy. So anyway, obviously, as Socrates' view of the unexamined life is that it's not worth living. In other words, to just go through life blissfully ignorant, never really questioning, like the prisoners in the cave, never really questioning the beliefs you grew up with, never really questioning your values and what's important in life. Socrates says, you want to know what I really taught the youth of Athens? You're accusing me of teaching them to be atheists, leading them away to the traditional gods, making them copies of myself because they're using my own questioning method. You know what I'm really teaching them? Wealth is important, but don't put wealth above being a good person. Don't be as concerned about wealth or your status in society or your position as you are about the status of your own soul and being a good person. Wealth doesn't make somebody a good person, but if somebody's already a good person, the other step's going to come. Socrates is not against wealth, but he's saying keep things in perspective, and I think that's something that even today is worth looking at. I mean, when you have shows, I told you I got a friend who's into the Real Housewives of X, and you see these other shows where just wealth and power and prestige and position are put as governing ideals, and you look at the lives of these people, and some of them are not very nice, not very good people, continually arguing, continually, with a lot of negative characteristics, So Socrates is right. Wealth doesn't necessarily make you good. But again, Socrates never argued that wealth guarantees that you're not going to be good. No, but he's just saying put things in perspective. Well, thank you very much. Bring a number 2 pencil. I still expect to have Scantron, so there is a bit of a glitch, but I think I've got enough at home for at least this test, and we'll worry about tomorrow when tomorrow comes. Thanks very much. If it helps you to review any of this, this recording should post in about 15 or 20 minutes. Have a good day, folks, and see you Thursday. And the test is all we'll do Thursday. It won't take most of you but 20 to 40 minutes. You'll be free to leave whenever you finish, So, take care. If anybody didn't wasn't here when I called the roll, let me know. Let me